that try and give you, lots of different opportunities. And so with that, I will say welcome. We're glad you're here. Please make the most of it. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Corinne Coulter, so that she can kind of give you the lay of the land before we introduce our special guest this evening.
Great, thank you, Monica. My name is Corinne Coulter, and I am the Program Director at Education for Tomorrow Alliance. And we're excited to have you guys here for our first Distinguished Speaker Series. I want to go over just some of the logistics before we get started. So typically this session, we have a couple of these throughout the semester. This session is going to be in meeting format. We'll have some that will follow up that will be in webinar, so they'll kind of look a little different. But for today, I just ask that you make sure that you've muted yourself. Make sure that if you can and you have a camera that's working. I know a couple of you emailed me that your camera's not working right now. That's fine, but if you have a camera that works and can turn that on, that will help us in interaction. That will help our Dr. Dunbar be able to interact with you guys. If you turn your screen to speaker view, you'll be able to see Dr. Dunbar, see her presentation a lot easier than seeing, I think we're at almost like 160 squares. So that's an option. And then if you have questions, we will do a Q&A time towards the end. But if you have questions, submit those into the chat feature. We'll be filtering through those. And then whenever it's time to ask your question, I will call on your name. So make sure that your name is your full first and last name written out, and ask you to unmute yourself to ask your question. So I think that's about it. Make sure that you please stay muted. Let's respect our presenter. Let's respect their time. And I will turn it over to Laura Lee Palmer, who is the EfTA board chair.
Thank you, Corinne and Monica. I appreciate so much being here, and I'm honored to serve as the chair of EfTA this year. And I want to take just a few minutes to introduce Dr. Dunbar and tell you a little bit about her incredibly distinguished career. And I'm going to let her fill in the gaps that I leave out. But she was born in Washington State and got her bachelor's and master's from both the University of Washington, and then quickly came to Houston and received her doctorate from the University of Houston. She began her incredibly distinguished career and has more honors longer than my arm. It's a huge long list of honors that she's earned over the life of her career. And she started after her graduation at Boeing in computer services, and then accepted a position later with the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center, and then soon after that became an astronaut, which is incredible. And she's had 5 spaceflight experiences. So she's been to space 5 times, which I think is pretty amazing for anybody to go once, and then to have that many missions is incredible. And today she is a professor at the University of Texas A&M. She's at Texas A&M University. I always say it backwards. Anyways, and we are just really thrilled to have you today and to kick off our Distinguished Speaker Series. And so I want to turn it over to you. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and an honor, and looks like we've got a great audience. Well, I'm a firm believer in a picture's worth 1,000 words. So I'm going to share my experiences and motivation for going into engineering, and a little bit about the future to help give some context to, I hope, what students are studying in school now and maybe where they want to go. So just a quick voice check. Do you hear me okay? Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and start sharing some pictures, some from space. I will encourage the students, if they haven't been to the NASA sites as well, there's of course a much larger library of photos, and most of my missions can be found actually on YouTube. So if you want to see the crew film, which might be 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and where we share our experiences in space, you can probably find those as well, and they're usually by an STS number, but I'll go to that in just a moment. So I'm going to share my screen and make sure you can all see it first. So can you all see that? Okay. So as was mentioned, I'm actually a professor of engineering at Texas A&M University in College Station. I'm here, this is my 5th year. I have a laboratory, it's called the Aerospace Human Systems Lab, and graduate students, and we're working on how fluids might behave in space as well as on the moon, which has 1/6 of Earth's gravity. You want to think about that. And also the design of the next generation or the future of spacesuits. And I want to thank the Education for Tomorrow Alliance for allowing me to share some of these experiences with you and some of my motivation and history and what got me here. And I like to kind of title my experience as thinking outside the sphere. Okay, we've all heard about thinking outside the box, but you know, the universe is a big place and we're just beginning to really understand it and explore it. But each little inch that we travel outside of our planet gives us miles of knowledge about our home planet and where we've been and where we hope to go. So my history actually goes back to my grandparents who immigrated to this country from Scotland, and they homesteaded in Oregon. Texas has a great Scottish tradition as well. And so it's always fun to come across that in the history here. But they came because they never had an opportunity to go to college. It was an opportunity to own their own land, worked very hard for it, mind you, but they came with this culture of learning and education, even if you had to learn by yourself, and how important it was. My grandfather was a fan of poetry, especially that of Robert Burns, and all the letters he wrote to me in college were in rhyme. He lived until he was 93. So he was actually very excited about the fact that I had that opportunity to go to college. My father was one of 3 boys that they raised, and he actually fought in World War II as a Marine and came back and met my mother, who grew up on a sheep ranch in Montana. And then they homesteaded together in a small community in the state of Washington, which is actually farther west than Texas. And I grew up with, as you'll see, with cowboy boots and cowboy hats because we had a cattle ranch. So that's that state that's up in the northwest corner of the United States. And this is the view that I had looking out on the top there, the window out of our front steps. Except for the mountains, it looks like parts of Texas. I could see Mount, this is Rainier over here, but I could see Mount Adams. We used to be able to see a mountain here called St. Helens, but it erupted in 1980, so it's a lot shorter than it used to be. And looking across the road at the Rattlesnake Mountains, we saw fields, and this looks the same now as it did before with the irrigation and many parts of Texas. And the nearest post office was about 7 miles away, I'd say, outlook. And it's looked like this for 70 years. It hasn't changed. It's just a small white building, 98938. We had a rural route post office. And just to make sure you know, the astronauts aren't born as adults. We all start out just like you as a kid. So, you know, what happened, what made it different that allowed me to be qualified to apply as an astronaut? Because you have to have the right education to follow that path, whether you're going to fly in the spacecraft or you're going to build them. Well, for one thing, I was the oldest of 4 children, and my parents allowed us to do a lot of things on a ranch. And this was my father, and he put me on his favorite bull called Bolivar. And this was a very calculated risk because my dad's holding on to me. But even when I show it to a lot of students in classrooms, they say, well, what did your mother think? And well, my mother took the picture because they're the only 2 out there. So, but I learned to take a few risks, not reckless risks, but to do things on my own, to, you know, ride a horse, to explore the area around us. And I loved learning and I loved exploring. So that was what it was like to grow up on our Diamond Double Bar Ranch. We had 2 younger brothers and later a younger sister. We rode horses for work. We didn't know that people actually bought time to ride them for fun, but they were our horses for roundup and for running our ranch. And so I was part of 4-H. I suspect some of the students out there are part of 4-H. I was in it for 9 years and raised horses, and with my brother raised steers. And through that, I learned responsibility, accountability, a lot about agriculture, a lot about biology, because you got to keep things alive, and mathematics, because we had to keep books. You know, we had to sell our animals at the end of the year. We had to determine whether we had a profit or a loss. So this was outside of school, but of course, school was a big part of growing up. Now, I do say that I went home every spring to do roundup with my father and his friends, because that was a tradition. And even well after I started work for NASA, I did that. And I can say that for one of our roundups that we actually had Walter Cronkite on the ranch too, who was doing a special on the new astronauts back when I was selected. Well, being in a rural area, I went to a very small rural school. In fact, my first school, called the Outlook Grade School, had 8 grades and 22 in my class. And most of those 22 were with me for 8 grades. And we actually had a graduation ceremony at the 8th grade. My introduction to science was in that school, but also on Saturdays, I'd watch a TV program. When we bought our first TV, I was 9 years old. It used to be in black and white, and we would watch Mr. Wizard. So I kind of challenge you, if you have access to the internet, you can actually see old episodes of Mr. Wizard teach science to middle school boys and girls. You see one boy and one girl, and the laws of physics and chemistry have not changed in hundreds of years. So it may be in black and white, but it's just as valid now as it was then. I also read science fiction, Jules Verne, From the Earth to the Moon. When Flash Gordon became a small program on TV, I watched that. And then when I was 8 years old, the very first satellite was launched. It was called Sputnik, and it was launched by the Soviet Union, now called Russia. It was only 23 inches in diameter, but that was the first man-made object that went into Earth's orbit. And it projected a radio signal, a small beep, beep, beep. And you could actually tune into this with your home radios as it circled the Earth. Now, for my parents who had just been through World War II, the thought of anybody flying over our territory, you know, the United States, was a little bit frightening. But I was 8 years old and I'd been reading science fiction. So what was exciting for me was finally that human beings were starting to put something in space, and that someday in the future, that might be an opportunity for me. But we had no astronauts when I started thinking about that. All I had were books, science fiction books, and teachers, and a program called Mr. Wizard. Well, the United States put up our first astronaut in 1961. It was Alan Shepard. And then later, John Glenn, he actually orbited the Earth, because Alan sort of went up and down, called suborbital. He flew again when he was 77 on the space shuttle. So I always kind of look at that as a future goal. You know, maybe they'll fly older people again, especially old female astronauts. But what was really exciting then is that in 1962, the President of the United States, President Kennedy, came to Texas. He came to Houston. And in the stadium at Rice University, he gave a speech about us going to the moon. And of course, I didn't see that as on TV. I heard it on the radio. It was played in our school over the intercom system. And I'm just going to share a few of his sentences because I think they're just as impactful now as they were then. He said, "This generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it, and we mean to lead it. This country was conquered by those who move forward, and so will space. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they are hard. The growth of our science and education will be enriched by new knowledge of our universe and environment." When he said those words, we had no satellites in Earth orbit, no satellites looking at hurricanes, no communication satellites. nothing, no computers, nothing to interact with your cell phone because there were no cell phones. In fact, our family was on a party phone line. It was a phone line we shared with about 7 other families. So think about where we were in technology at that time. But with that commitment of going to the moon, which is what he made, by the end of the decade, we transformed the technology in this country, and it gave me the opportunity to go to the University of Washington through scholarships and funds for students who were interested in science and engineering. Well, I didn't actually know what science and engineering was because my family also hadn't been to a university. But in the eighth grade, when I spoke to my 8th grade principal, who had also been my 6th grade teacher, about wanting to go to space and having to take a new class in high school, because I was going to take another bus to this high school that was another 7 miles away. I told him I wanted to go to space or build spacecraft. And he said, you'll need to take algebra. And I said, what's that? And he said, trust me. So I did. I took algebra in the 9th grade, which led to geometry and math analysis and trigonometry. And didn't start out being easy, but I kept thinking about what Mr. Miller had said, and I knew I had to master those classes if I wanted to go further. So I did get to my senior year, and I was accepted into the University of Washington, but I didn't know what to major in. So I went to my physics teacher, because I took biology, chemistry, and physics. Those sciences and those mathematics are the core classes you need to go into science and engineering even today. And I asked him, what block should I check on this form? What college should I enter in the university? And he said, I think you should become an engineer. And once again, I said, I'm not sure what that is. And he said, well, trust me. So I did. And it was the perfect choice for me. So I entered engineering at the University of Washington in Seattle. Now, when I entered engineering, there were no computers. There were no handheld calculators. I had to buy a slide rule. I still have my slide rule. And you should learn how to operate a slide rule. It doesn't tell you where the decimal point is. You have to figure that out. But it's a very accurate computational device that had been around since 1622. So since 1622 until about the 1970s, we relied on this computational device until the first handheld calculator came out in about 71. Well, while I was studying engineering, we actually reached the moon. And so the first man walked on the moon, July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. And we went back and landed a total of 5 times. So 12 men have walked on the moon, but many more have actually also orbited the moon. And it gave us our first look at the Earth. Because remember, we didn't have satellites up there to look back at the Earth. We saw the Earth when we went to the moon. And it was out of that mission that we started to build our Earth monitoring environmental satellites, where we learned to study the weather, and we studied the ocean, and we studied geology from orbit now too. So that technology of going to the moon was transformed into even the study of our own Earth. Well, while I was at the University of Washington, I went into what was called materials engineering now. And I went into it because the department chair promised that I could work on the brand new project called the Space Shuttle. And this was, the cartoon of what it was to land or launch like a rocket, orbit the Earth, and land like an airplane. We didn't have any reusable spaceflight vehicles. This was designed to fly 100 times each vehicle, take experiments and research and cargo to orbit, and then bring it back. So a launch is only about 9 minutes, but we could stay up more than 2 weeks. And landing was about 45 minutes. But this is not how a mission really works. You go up and come down. You orbit the Earth. And once in orbit at about 150 miles up there, it takes you only 90 minutes to go around the Earth. you're traveling 25 times the speed of sound, 17,500 miles per hour, or Mach 25, as we like to say. We actually get a patch that says Mach 25 when we fly. What really fascinated me was the fact that in order to make this vehicle reusable and come through the Earth's atmosphere, which generated really high heats, they had to have a brand new material that covered the bottom of the shuttle. And so based on that, that's why I went into the department, and Doc Muller, who was chair of the department, promised that I could meet NASA engineers, and he was true to his word. I worked there on the summer on the Space Shuttle Thermal Protection System and met my first NASA engineers. And although I worked for Boeing, the job here, the research here led me to a position at Rockwell International Space Division in California, working on Columbia, the first space shuttle. And I mean, even if I hadn't become an astronaut, I think, you know, being a young engineer, and I was pretty young, it's got 29 in that picture, working on a brand new vehicle that was out of science fiction was just incredible. But I also applied to be in the first astronaut class. And my company was very supportive. In fact, they wrote this article about my selection. But unfortunately, as you'll learn later, I wasn't selected. But I was invited to NASA into Mission Control, as you heard, and worked there for 2 years, and then reapplied and was selected for the class of 1980. So there I am right there with my class of 21 new astronauts. I trained for about 5 years for my first flight and in 1985. But what was really thrilling for me was to be able to be part of a program that I helped to design, thermal protection system on the shuttle, and to fly on it 5 times. We built 5 shuttles. We flew over 30 years, 135 missions. And most people don't know we flew that many times. People were getting so bored with space flights that they stopped showing them on TV, but we kept flying. We built the International Space Station. We launched the Hubble Space Telescope. We changed the instruments. We flew experiments for, thousands of experiments, but we flew experiments too for high school kids and middle school kids and junior high kids, and for many, many schools. So it was a very productive and fun program to be a part of. I just wanted to show you this launch picture real quickly, because there's something for those of you studying physics that you can find this picture on the internet and take it back to your professor or instructor. And that is, as you launch and you go from 0 velocity to 17,500, you go through the speed of sound. And when you do that, you create a shock wave. And there are 2 shock waves on the shuttle, and it disrupts the atmosphere. That's why it creates this little cloud around there. So if you have high-speed photography, you can actually see it go through the sound barrier there. And this shock wave will propagate to the ground. So if you're on the ground, that's where you hear the sonic boom. So there were shock waves going up, and there were shock waves coming down. So when we landed in California, the spectators on the ground would hear 2 sonic booms, and that came from that shock wave that's coming back through the speed of sound. Now, the shuttle was pretty roomy compared to the old capsules. It had a big flight deck, and it had a big mid deck. It was like an airplane, and we could fly and launch with 4 people on the flight deck and 4 on the mid deck. We had lockers. That's where we had all our food and clothing and experiments. But the flight deck was just like the cockpit of an airplane. It's where we had all of our command and controls. We had an airlock so we could do spacewalks. Not shown is the galley where we cooked our meals, and then the waste management system over here. But if you look down on it and saw the whole thing, this is what made this shuttle really special. It had this big cockpit, windows in the front, windows on the top, and this really big cargo bay. About 2 school buses, 60 feet long and 15 feet in diameter. And every mission was different. So 135 missions with different sets of cargo. In this case, it's a laboratory built by Europe called the Space Lab, built by the European Space Agency, connected by a tunnel to the crew compartment, and it had a docking adapter. So you may be wondering who took this picture. Well, this picture was taken when we're about ready to dock to the Russian space station, Mir, in 1995, and that's a mission I was on too. So it was a little bit like an old movie. If you, and some of the adults in the room might have remembered Space Odyssey 2001, but we were docking to a space station with a shuttle, and it was pretty exciting, I'll tell you. So my first crew in 1985 was sponsored by West Germany. So you can see their flags there. We had 5 Americans, 2 German physicists right here and right here. And we had Wubo Ockels from the Netherlands. He was also a physicist. And the rest were the American crew. So we flew in what was called the Space Lab. And we trained in Europe for 18 months on their experiments, which flew back here. And I was also a spacewalk trained crew member as well. And it was a great mission, 7 days long. In 1990, I operated the robotic arm to capture a satellite that we'd had in orbit for 5 years, collecting information on the space environment because it's up in vacuum. And we wanted to know how the sunlight, the solar spectrum, and the vacuum affected materials that we were going to build other satellites out of, as well as the space station. That was important to know. And the only way, we couldn't simulate it on the Earth, so the only way we could really find out was go to space. And there were 5 of us on that flight because we couldn't go in the payload bay. This filled the whole payload bay, almost the whole length. Then on my 3rd flight in 92, I got to fly another Space Lab flight as the payload commander on Columbia, the vehicle I'd helped to build. And this was a 13-day flight, all American crew with all our research. And so you can see how roomy it is in the lab, just like any other laboratory, except we're weightless. So if my feet weren't in these foot loops down there, I'd float away. So I have to anchor myself with my feet so I can use both my hands. In this case, I'm putting samples into a high temperature furnace. Back behind me, Dr. Larry DeLucas is a protein crystallographer from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and he's at a glove box here growing a number of protein crystals that are used in the medical industry to inform the structure of drugs. So you can look that up, look up protein crystallography and how microgravity has made a big difference in the advancement of the pharmaceutical industry. And then I had something really exciting happen. We decided that we were going to build a space station with the Russians, which is up there right now, but we wanted to practice first. So we practiced by flying the shuttle and docking it to their space station called Mir. And I was part of the first crew sent over to train with the Russians in Star City. So I had my own Russian crew, Anatoly Solovyev and Nikolai Budarin. Had my own custom Russian spacesuit, and we also did winter survival training in Siberia. So survival training is required of any spaceflight vehicle, but it was quite fun to do it in Siberia. I was a backup to Norm Thagard, who did fly to Mir, and I came back and trained to fly on the shuttle that docked to Mir, and we picked up Norm and his 2 crew members, and we had the largest group of astronauts and cosmonauts ever in space. We set a record in 1995 of 10 people. And since it's not a big space, this is how you take a microgravity 0G photograph with all of us. And because I trained in Russia, they let me put our crew patch on part of the Russian space station right under the picture of Yuri Gagarin, who was the first person in space. Now the Mir is no longer in Earth orbit because it kind of outlived its life, and we built the space station that's up there now. But I was part of 2 docking missions. So the first in 95, and by the way, it's great pictures from the space station, and the second in 98. We docked 9 times, and those 9 times gave us the experience, both from engineering as well as cultural, as well as working with 2 space agencies to go ahead and start building the International Space Station starting in October of 1998. But all missions are pretty similar. On the shuttle, we walked out to the Astrovan. We got in, we took an elevator up to the gantry that put us in the, and walked over and got strapped into our seats in the space shuttle. And then we docked with the Russian space station Mir. This is what it looked like out in space before we docked. As we get closer, you can see the Russian space capsule called the Soyuz, and this was what we actually docked to. The film for this flight, STS-89, is on the internet. You can probably Google it. I think it's on YouTube. And you can see the entire narration by the crew on this whole mission. I think it's probably about 17 minutes long. And once again, our crew photo of 10 is us all circled around, head together, about the only way we can get us all in the picture. I have a couple pictures of us actually undocking. And you may wonder, well, if you got crew here and crew here, who took the picture of us undocking? Well, some of the cosmonauts actually got in their vehicle and they undocked to take a picture of us actually undocking. So somewhere I'm in there as we're undocking from the Mir space station. And this is just to prove I was there. Okay, so I'm in the commander's seat. Well, we came back to Earth, put on our pressure suits, and this is coming back during reentry. Another artist concept, a much more modern concept of the shuttle coming through the high speed, with high speed generating all this heat on the exterior, coming through the Earth's atmosphere, over the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and then landing like a glider. Now, I'm just going to share very quickly about 2 minutes of the sounds of a launch. I hope it plays, because I don't know how many of you've actually seen a launch. I know you probably haven't been down to watch one, because we haven't launched some American soil. Well, we just did the first one since 2011. There are a lot of launches on the internet, but I'm just going to play the first part of it for you. So we'll hopefully let that run. Actually, did you hear any sound on that launch? Oh, good. Okay. So you just saw the first 2 minutes. There's another 6 minutes with the main engine for us to get to orbit. But it's, we don't hear the sound. I get that question because we're so far ahead of the sound that it's behind us. Everybody on the ground hears the sound. So we finished a mission. It was very successful. My last mission, a little bit bittersweet, but I went into NASA management at that point until about 2005. The two pilots congratulated themselves because they rolled out on the center line, which is hard when you're flying a glider. And we had a great sunset that final landing day. Well, we started to build the International Space Station. I encourage you to look up when it's on the internet, when it's going to come over where you live. It's as big as a football field. You don't need a telescope. My 93-year-old mother does this. She goes to the internet, finds out when it's coming over her place, and goes out and looks for it. If it's coming right over, you can see it for as long as 6 minutes. And I want you to think about the fact there's probably 6 people up there, and you can go to the internet and find out who they are and read about them. There's people just like you, but they had a goal of going to space. We're now done with it. And so we've been flying crews back and forth, and we've been flying resupply vehicles from Europe and Japan and Russia, and launch vehicles from the United States and Russia to dock with it. So the shuttle was docking with it, but so was the Russian Soyuz as well. This is just a little bit of a bittersweet picture of the last shuttle landing in 2011. So this is the plasma contrail it leaves as it comes back into the Earth's atmosphere and is generating all that heat on the outside. But one of my favorite views was always looking back out at space. There are billions and billions of stars out there. You know that now. And when you don't have the Earth's atmosphere to fuzz your optics, you can see so many stars. And those are all places that we need to understand and hopefully can explore someday. It's not science fiction anymore. I saw science fiction in my short lifetime become science fact when we got to space and we went on to the moon. So we've been in the station for 20 years, and we hope it's another 20. We know at least till 2028, but probably beyond. We've flown astronauts from 32 nations and 5 space agencies, US, Europe, Russia, Japan, and Canada. Over 200 people have flown on the station alone, and 400 if you include the space shuttle. And so I was very proud of the fact that I was part of the shuttle program, its 30-year program, and helping to build the International Space Station and to really pave the way for future science and exploration. So what's next? Big question. Well, we're going back to the moon, and we're planning to go to Mars in your lifetime. This is what you might see in the next 10 years is a lunar base, like a base in Antarctica. And in Mars, we're planning to go there with humans in 2030. New spacesuits, new robotics, habitats we have to build and design. And we're not alone. If you look at history and you look at the fact that we put the first lander on Mars in 1976, history is not about if, it's about who and when. So Russia's still looking at going to the moon and Mars. China has been launching their own astronauts. They've launched 11 to date. India is planning to launch its own astronauts the end of next year. And Europe has been flying with us, but they're planning for a habitat based on the moon as well. So this is an exciting century to be involved in space. It's not science fiction, it's careers, building the infrastructure, but actually visiting it. And so NASA's put what they call a roadmap to Mars, Journey to Mars, which includes the space station and the moon, technology, exploration, and science. We selected the first class of astronauts that are training to actually go to the moon. And you can see them all standing there. I believe this is 7 men and 6 women. I may have the numbers a little bit different, but very diverse core. We're planning to put the first crews back on the moon in 2024. That program is called Artemis, and one of those will be a woman too. So we'll have the first woman on the moon. We'll have a space station around the moon called Cislunar, and that's called Gateway. So just want to leave with a couple of closing thoughts here, is whether it's the pyramids or Mars exploration, the foundations of our progress in technology and even civilization, because that's our buildings, that's our communication and infrastructure, requires that we have engineers and chemists and physicists. And the building blocks for that, like Mr. Miller told me, and like Mr. Anderson told me, are mathematics, biology, chemistry, and physics. If you get out of high school with those subjects, you can go almost any path. About 70%, in fact, of all the majors, whether you're going into medicine or other related occupations, are going to require that you have that good foundation in mathematics. Algebra has been around for 2,000 years, okay? And I know I was intimidated a little bit by that word when I when I got into ninth grade, but I realized I could solve almost any problem with it. In fact, problems for my dad, the rancher, you solve those problems every day in life without realizing that you're using algebra. But it's important to keep your vision in the future. And if we're going to make change, it's up to you. Don't wait till someone else does it. You can be first. As Gandhi said, we must become the change we want to see. If you envision it and you dream it, you can make it happen. So my favorite hero is Robert Goddard, who died before I was born, actually, but he's known as the father of modern rocketry. And like my grandfather, they were born in the same year. He had a dream, but he was born on the East Coast. He was 17 when he was valedictorian of his class in a small high school. And he had this dream of going high enough and far enough that people could go to Mars. And so he started building rockets. He studied physics, built rockets, built the first liquid-fueled rocket, but died just after World War II. And it was his wife who was ensured that his patents were published and were the foundation of us going to the moon. In fact, the New York Times, back when he gave a lecture in the 20s, kind of ridiculed him and said even the simplest high school student knows that liquid-fueled rockets are impossible. And they apologized to him when Neil Armstrong launched to the moon on the front page of the New York Times, a public apology to Robert Goddard. And we have a Space Flight Center named after him now in Greenbelt, Maryland, the Goddard Space Flight Center. And they are responsible for building all of the robotic observatories that are exploring the universe now. And if you visit that center, you'll find the words on this page printed on paper, engraved in stone, and I keep them on my desk. It's difficult to say what is impossible, for the dreams of yesterday are the hopes of today and the realities of tomorrow. So I'd like to leave that with you, because each of you has dreams that you hope will become realities, and you are in the driver's seat. What you do in school today, the subjects you take, and how well you apply it yourself will make the future you want to see. So thank you, and may all your dreams become reality.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We can all do our, if you can, all do our clap if you know how to use the reactions. Thank you so much. It looks like we do have a couple questions coming in, and so
I'm happy to take them.
I'm gonna, Bridget, if you can unmute yourself. Is it Bridget Jarman? If you can unmute yourself.
Can.
All right, we can hear you.
Can I ask my question?
Yes, ma'am.
What was the thought that went through your mind when you were on your first flight?
Don't make any mistakes. We trained pretty hard, and I wanted a second flight, so I was pretty focused on doing everything right.
Great, thank you, Bridget. All right, they're coming in fast, so I don't want to. Nandini, are you there?
Yes.
Yes. All right. You were one of our internship kids. If you want to ask your question.
Thank you for coming today. My question was, you talked about fluid shift, and I read from about it. It was about a shipment food that Russians had, a bracelet of some kind. So could you talk about fluid shift and about your research and your information about Gateway?
About fluid shift?
And also about Gateway program. Your thoughts about Gateway program.
I'm sorry, which program?
The Gateway.
Oh, the Gateway. Okay, so fluid shift, because you're in a weightless environment, you're not hanging upside down, but everything, all the fluids that, gravity takes to your feet redistribute in the body. And when you're in a weightless period for a long period of time, that puts some more pressure on your carotid arteries. And there's pressure sensors in there, and they tell the brain, well, I got too much fluid. So you start to excrete it. And over about 2 days, you may urinate out about 1 liter of water, but you're in a new equilibrium. We call it homeostasis. And you're okay as long as you're in orbit. But when you come back down to Earth, now you're about 1 liter less than you should, and it's harder for your heart to keep the blood pumped to your brain. So before we return, we always drink about, we drink about 4 liters of water with salt to rehydrate and make sure we've got the blood volume so we don't faint due to gravity as we come back in. There are other changes due to fluid shift, and you can find those all online with the NASA Human Health Program, HHP, what they consider risks due to microgravity and information about the fluid shift. Now the Gateway is about going back to the moon. So the Artemis is the overall mission to return by 2024, and Gateway is the new space station that we'll be putting in around the moon. That answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Great, thank you. Okay, Aiden Seymour, are you still on?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, go for it.
So I was wondering, so what were like some of the biggest challenges that you've had to face in your career?
Well, first of all, I always had very supportive people around me. My parents, my teachers, you saw a couple of them, the department chair when I went into ceramic engineering and told him I wanted to meet NASA engineers. I think it's important to articulate your interests. You can't expect people to mind read what you want to do, okay? You have to share with them what you want to do, but you also have to work to make sure you're qualified. So I think if I look back at my career, the biggest challenge I had was when I went to train in Russia. I was in my 40s and I knew the science, but I had to operate and learn Russian for the first time. And Russian is not just a different language, it has a different alphabet, 33 characters. So I think the hardest thing I had to do was to learn how to do everything I knew how to do in Russian.
All right, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, Deborah, are you still on?
Yeah.
All right, you can ask your question.
All right. So, if you could change anything about your career or your life, what would it be?
Wouldn't change anything. I mean, I've been very blessed and fortunate, so I wouldn't change anything. When you go through life, not everything is perfect, but you learn from that. And so I had a little bit of a circuitous route. I had illness in the family, had deaths in the family, ran out of money, was, I was a waitress and running a movie theater. I worked my way through college. So, but I learned from all those experiences. And so they helped to build the person you are. I can't think I mean, I'm not sure I'd be where I am if I changed anything. So whatever happened was a pathway that led me to where I am. Does that help?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, looks like we can get a couple more. Ava, I don't want to mess up your last name.
It's Zegrelli.
Okay.
What were the what were the steps, like the biggest step that you went to applying to get on the crew for the mission?
But first you apply to NASA to be an astronaut. So you have to fill out a lot of information. And that's important to do. It takes a long period of time. You have to be very precise about it. They'll ask you information on your health, your academics, and your work experience. I think it's also important to note that the average age at selection, when I was selected, was about 35. So you've been out in the work world. So you need to make sure you've got a lot of options, but every job you do, you want to do well. And NASA's looking for the ability to work in a group as a team, but also having a diverse background, maybe more than one discipline. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Sorry, it keeps moving. Okay. Dwana, I know I say your name wrong every time we're in NGL, so are you
Hey.
still on?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, go for it.
So I want to go into engineering. So I was wondering what advice you would have for anybody that wants to go into engineering.
Oh, well, I think it's a great career, and we're looking for more talent and exciting people that go into engineering. One of our challenges is to get past some of the old stereotypes. You know, we work with people, we solve real problems, we get to build things or design them. There's software engineers as well. I think the best advice I can give, though, is make sure you really take advantage of your free high school education and take as much math and science as you can and work with your teachers, because that will determine whether you can get into an engineering school. All engineering schools are known as professions, just like medical school and law, which means there's a minimum set of requirements to get in, and universities that are accredited for engineering, it's called ABET. You want to look for that, ABET, because NASA will only, for example, companies only hire from ABET accredited universities, but there's a minimum set of requirements, and they're going to want to know that you've taken physics. You've got to have physics. That's how the world works. Got to have physics, and you don't necessarily have to have calculus, but having some pre-calculus helps, because we'll teach calculus again in the freshman year. We'd rather have our students have a really good foundation in algebra. We sometimes get students that have done well on multiple choice tests and calculus, but don't understand the algebra and setting up the problem to begin with. So make sure you get real comfortable with just, you know, solving problems in your household. You know, if this is X and this is Y, what is this, you know? And then understand the algebra, geometry, and trigonometry. You know, we seem to put trigonometry sometimes in algebra too, but don't emphasize it. And that's sine waves and cosine waves. But that's how electricity works. That's how AC electrical systems work in your house. So if you don't understand alternating currents and AC, and you know, that's radio waves, that's really important as well. You can get that all in high school. It's all there. Does that help?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I'm currently taking all of those classes.
That's great.
And I'll just add, problem solving helps you regardless of what field you go into. Any employer will say, be a problem solver. So Cameron Rollmeyer has asked a question probably 5 times throughout. So I'm going to give him a chance to go ahead and ask.
My question was, what was the coolest thing you've ever done in space or about space?
Well, you know, cool's an interesting word, but I really like 2 aspects of the environment that you really can't get on Earth. One is being weightless all the time. And the other is actually orbiting around the Earth and being able to orbit once every 90 minutes. And you're not over the same spot each time, because as you're orbiting in inertial space, you know, you're out in the universe here, you're just orbiting. It's the Earth that's turning around underneath you. So each orbit, it's called precessing, is about a 15-degree difference. So eventually you'll see all the Earth, okay, depending on your inclination, we call it the angle with respect to the equator. But the Earth's rotating under you as you're rotating, and so you get to see a lot of the Earth. It's, you know, it's fun. We take photography lessons so that we can take pictures of the geography, as well as the geology and meteorology and oceanography of the Earth, and that's collected as part of the science of the study of the Earth. And that's always enjoyable. It gives us an excuse to look out the window as well. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. It looks like we could probably squeeze a couple more questions in, if that's all right with you. Abby, I've seen your name pop up a couple times. If you would like to unmute yourself.
Hi. What's it like to be able to Google yourself and relive your old missions? Were you the only, or often the only woman on your team, and did that ever affect you in any way? And what do you think about the SpaceX launch?
I don't Google myself. If I want to relive a mission, I can just look at an old video or old pictures like I just showed you. The second question was,
were you often the only woman on your team, and did that ever affect you in any way?
well, first of all, no, I had 2 missions where there were 2 women, and there was actually one other shuttle mission with three women, but I was often the only woman on some of my engineering teams at Rockwell. And that never bothered me. It always bothered me that it bothered other women. You know, if you're afraid of being the only one, you'll never be an explorer, okay? And if you're paying too much attention to being about being female, you're causing the other people around you to pay attention to it. You gotta be part of the team. If you're part of the team, then people don't see gender. So, you know, that's that. And now we're just really looking for all kinds of people, men and women, to come into engineering. We don't have enough engineers to do all these great things. So, and when they decide they want to be an engineer, they're halfway through college and they didn't take the math, and they could go back and take the math, but they feel too much peer pressure to graduate on time. So then they regret not going into engineering 10 years later. So I hear that all the time. So, you know, it's a great career. It's a good foundation for other degrees as well. Engineers with an MBA, engineers combined with medical degrees is a big thing now at A&M. We have a degree called the NMed, which is engineering and medicine. So don't worry about whether or not you're the only girl. And the third question was, what do I think about SpaceX? Well, one of those careers I had between NASA and now was I was the president and CEO of the Museum of Flight in Seattle, which is an air and space museum. And we had most of the history of aeronautics there because Mr. Boeing built the first small airplane as an airmail out of Seattle. And one of the things I learned is that we have a commercial airline industry now, but it started out as government. When the government bought the Wright brothers flyer design, nobody wanted to buy tickets to fly in a Wright flyer. When airmail started, it was the government who built the airplanes and flew them so that we could get mail around the country. And then we started, you know, private public partnerships, and they grew the airline industry. We're doing that in space now. And a lot of people don't realize that the SpaceX vehicles docking to the station are partly funded by NASA. In fact, we gave SpaceX about $1 billion to develop this capability. Same with Boeing, so that we'd have other ways to get to the station and we can devote ourselves to exploration. So they've got to be successful if we're going to build a national infrastructure that will support tourism.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I want to squeeze in one more question, only because I don't want to, she's asked it multiple times and I don't want to leave her hanging. Kaylin Harrison, are you there still?
Well, with that, we are at the end of our time. So please, let's give a round of applause to Dr. Dunbar.
Thank you very much. Encourage you to, whether you go into science and engineering or not, I encourage you to take as much math and science in high school just to understand the headlines in the paper. It makes you a more articulate citizen.
Agreed. I want to thank again the John Cooper School and Memorial Herman the Woodlands Medical Center for supporting today's chance to engage. And Corinne, did you have a couple of wrap-up things about next time or post surveys or anything like that that you wanted to share?
Yes, so I know that some of you, thank you again for attending. Thank you, Dr. Dunbar. You will get a wrap-up email with kind of the details from today, of Dr. Dunbar's bio, but then also a quick post session survey to just kind of get your feedback. Since this is our first time doing this, we want to make sure that we are able to be successful later on. Our next session coming up is going to be on, I had the date, I lost it, on October 1st, and it will be, no, is that right? Yes. October 1st, Mr. Mark Lasher, who is the CEO and president of Chevron Phillips Chemical Company. So thank you again, students, for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Dunbar, for joining us this evening. We hope that you guys have a great rest of your evening. Look for the email follow-up and give us your feedback. We hope that you guys have a great evening and a happy Friday and happy weekend.
We all still get credit, right?
And that is up to your whoever you report to at school.
Thank you, Dr. Dunbar. It is, you know, you gave us the privilege of speaking a couple years ago at an internship luncheon, and I know all of the adults in the room came up to me afterwards. They're like, I know that was for the kids, but no, growing up at a time of the space race, they were like, I had a tear in my eye just thinking about what that was like as a kid, and to see kind of you go to fruition and you know and have that journey. So it really is a joy to hear your path and your successes, and have a chance for us to, the rest of us, to benefit from the things that you've learned along the way. So thank you.